conflicts in relationships, tensions across social classes, the impact of unthoughtful speech, the search for practical advice for how to live, hypocritical religious people, and the mega wealthy oppressing and taking advantage of their position. I'm not talking about this week's news cycle, although I could have been. We're talking about some of the themes that come up in James. We titled this series, Ancient Wisdom for a Modern World. And I hope that as we've gone through this, you've been able to see that these are not issues that only made sense 2,000 years ago. They make direct sense into the world in which we live. And many of the problems that we face are human problems. They're not exclusive to a certain time frame or not. So this is our penultimate talk in this series on the letter of James, or Jacob as his Hebrew name is. And last week we looked at the kind of fighting that was happening within these local early church communities. They had been fighting, and James's point to them last week was, if you're quarreling and fighting, that's a sign that you're on the wrong team. You're not working for Team Jesus. And so he calls them to repent, to basically submit themselves to God, resist the devil, remember that, and then come near to God and receive the grace that God wants to give you as you turn back to him. So this week he packs no less punch, as you would expect from James. And some of those same themes around pride and humility and how we speak and our attitudes to money are going to come up in our passages today. So there's 3 short paragraphs, and I'm going to take them 1, 2, 3, and we'll look at each of them. So first up, James 4, verse 11 to 12. We'll put it on the screen. Brothers and sisters, do not slander one another. Anyone who speaks against a brother or sister or judges them speaks against the law and judges it. When you judge the law, you are not keeping it, but sitting in judgment on it. There is only one lawgiver and judge, the one who is able to save and destroy. But you, who are you to judge your neighbor? So first thing to notice in this little section here is, so last week, remember the strong language that he had for people. He said, you adulterers. And he talked about you sinners. And he had these strong languages to basically say, like, pay attention. Here he returns to that more kind of familial, kind of gentle, brothers and sisters. Let me speak to you as family. And again, we've got that very clear theme throughout James about how we speak to one another. He says, do not slander. And slander just means, speaking negatively about someone where there's no kind of actual evidence of it being true. Speaking badly about someone else. And we sometimes hear this in the news because for some people, when they're slandered publicly, they take it to the courts because the courts have to decide if this person has been slandered, has they been spoken against, and the whole legal framework around this. And James is basically saying that as a family, as this new community of believers, you should not speak badly about one another. And it's quite a simple command in some ways. It's like, just don't speak badly about your brothers and sisters. But in practice, it can be quite a difficult thing to live out because we all sometimes face into that negativity of like, oh, that person really annoys me. And he's basically saying there shouldn't be any negativity in the way you speak about other people within the church community. Never mind the fighting that we've just been talking about. He says, if you can deal with the way you speak about one another, you will avoid the fights before they become fights. And he's like basically saying, if you're inside, if you actually love the people around you, then your speech will match up to it, is the kind of basic message. And sadly, I'd like to tell you that slander doesn't happen in the church, but unfortunately it does. And I've seen firsthand the impact of slander when people say things about other people that may or may not be true, and it can cause all sorts of division. It's a painful thing. If you've ever experienced someone slandering you, someone speaking negatively about you, and then you hear about it maybe from someone else, that's a painful process to walk through. And James is saying basically slander is like a cancer in the church. When it grows and develops, it creates alliances and it creates danger. And unfortunately, it can lead to things like church splits and breakdowns in relationships across communities, which is why he's basically saying, no, don't do it. Don't sow suspicion amongst your relationships. Don't cause things to break down. James isn't, of course, saying that we can't ever disagree with someone. That's not what he's saying. He's not saying that we should never have feedback for other people around us. He's just saying that if you have love in your heart towards others, speaking negatively about them is evidence you don't have love in your heart for them. And he makes this point very kind of simply and clearly. He's saying if you understand this idea that we're called to love our neighbors, then the way you speak really matters. And he goes further than that. He says basically if you do speak badly about other people within the Christian community, you're putting yourself over God himself. You're actually putting yourself as judge. You're saying, I know God said love your neighbor, but in this instance, I feel justified in what I'm saying. And he's saying whenever we do that, we step above God and we try and put ourselves as judge. And we come across this idea in our culture all the time, the idea that the same rules don't apply to everyone. And we often think we're the exception to the rule. But we see it in particularly perhaps for those who are well-to-do or wealthy or in power in our culture. They sometimes think the rules don't apply to them. And James is basically about to talk about some of these topics about the wealthy in the church. And he's saying, don't become the kind of people who think the rules don't apply to you. And he's basically saying the law is love your neighbor. Don't act like that is not something that we're actually called to live. And he says there's only one judge, there's only one person who actually gets to make decisions about who's right and wrong, and that's God. And in very strong language again, he says, only he can save you or destroy you. He's basically saying, just remember, you actually do have to give account for the words that you speak to others. And of course, we know there's forgiveness, we know there's grace. But he's saying, don't forget, God is the one who's going to arbitrate between things ultimately. That's not your job. So it's a basic point, don't slander. Don't speak badly about others in the Christian community. We're now coming to our second paragraph. So this is the second section of here. James 4:13-17. We'll put it on the screen. Now listen. You who say, today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money. Why you do not even know what will happen tomorrow? What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while, then vanishes. Thanks, James. Instead, you ought to say, if it's the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogant schemes. All such boasting is evil. If anyone then who knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them. So again, another heavy passage from James, but he's very direct and to the point. He's talking again about pride. This theme that goes throughout. Humility is wisdom and pride is foolishness. That's the kind of theme that goes throughout. And in verse 13 he says, he's kind of got this hypothetical situation where he's talking about, and he says, today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business and make money. Now, as way of reminder, he's writing to Jewish communities that are spread beyond the boundaries of Israel, and most of these communities were formed by people looking for new economic opportunities. So these were people who, because the Romans had now built the roads and they could easily travel across Asia and that whole area, they were like, there's a better business opportunity if we go over here. So these are the actual communities he's writing to. And so there's a specific group he has in mind here. He's saying, all you merchants, the ones that have gone out to try and seize the economic opportunity, pay attention to what I am saying here. And these are like the entrepreneurs. And they're obviously onto something of a winner because they've found that if they can travel to new places, they can make money. And business is good for them. And they have a clear goal in mind. They're like, we've got our near-term financial models have been worked out. We've got our strategic plans and our business goals all set out and laid out for the years ahead. They have a clear plan of how they're going to grow their profit. And James effectively pulls the rug away from their planning. And he says, you don't even know what's going to happen tomorrow. What is your life? That's quite a... Imagine somebody came up to you and said, what is your life? You'd be like, okay, thanks. But he's basically saying you have all these plans, these grand plans to kind of, for world domination or whatever it is. And he says, you don't even know what's going to happen in the next hour. There's an arrogance here about the future. There's an arrogance about thinking you know how it's all going to work out. You know, this idea of like not knowing what's going to happen, I have the same problem, but in reverse. I don't know what I did yesterday, but I don't think that's quite what James is getting at here. He's saying, zoom out a moment. You have zero knowledge of the future. You don't know anything that's going to happen in the future. Now you might think that sounds a bit scary, doesn't it? But that's his point. He's saying we fool ourselves into thinking we know exactly how things are going to work out. Hands up if your life has gone exactly to your plan. Everything that you ever thought you would plan, and it's just exactly laid out exactly. It's been easy. It's just been a walk in the park, hasn't it? He's saying, have some perspective here. And then he says, what is your life? You're a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. James, thanks for your encouragement once again. There I was with all my great plans and my vision board prepared and my 9-point strategic business plan. And now you're telling me I'm nothing but a puff of smoke. That's basically what the word is. It's like a puff of smoke. It's just gone. It's there for a second and it's absolutely gone. It's like when you have a shower and the mirror steams up. And then, like, depending on how good your ventilation is, like a couple of minutes later, it's clear again, gone. Or the mist that forms sometimes early in the morning, and it's like hovers on the ground. And then as soon as the sun pops up, it's like, boom, vaporizes. He's saying that is what your life is like. And it's a really kind of, in some ways, a harsh reality check. But have you noticed that in the Bible, this idea of being aware of how transient our lives are is connected to wisdom again and again and again. If you read through Proverbs, if you read through Ecclesiastes, if you read through any of the wisdom literature, you will find this theme of being aware of how small our lives are in perspective. Psalm 90 verse 12 says, teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom. This idea of wisdom is connected to this idea of seeing our lives in perspective. On the scale of the universe, our lives are pretty tiny. Now, this could sound deeply depressing, but I think it's also deeply freeing. Because one of the problems we all face into is that we tend to live our lives as though we're the hero in our own story. We live our lives as though, I'm the good-looking actor who is going to conquer all the evil and has great plans for the future. And we see other people as kind of the supporting cast. They're the people that are just happen to be in our lives. But my story is the main story. And we've got the supporting cast and maybe even a few villains. None of them are in the room, obviously. But this idea that we put ourselves at the center of every story, don't we? And when the way we think about our lives and where we're going, it's all focused around us being the hero. Now, I don't know anyone who's titled their autobiography Mist. Because we don't like to think about that, do we? Do you know if the crowning achievement of our life was summarized as mist? How would we feel? How many of you know the first name of your great-grandfather? Frankie does. Yeah, a couple. Yeah. The rest of us, this is a perspective check. In a few generations, a lot of people will not know our names. And again, that sounds depressing, but I think it's actually freeing to realize that we're part of something much bigger. And James's basic point is that you're not in control of your life. And even if you were in control of your life, your impact is small in the scale. And I think that's quite freeing because it frees us up. You okay? It frees us up to just live our lives without great expectations or pressure to have to be something. We can just live our lives in the moment without having to know the future. And for these Christian businessmen and women, he has a message. He says, instead, you ought to say, if it's the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogant schemes. All such boasting is evil. In other words, make your plans, develop a vision, but don't arrogantly assume you know exactly how it's all going to work out. And just like in the first section, he has another message for them, which is basically, when you think you know what the future holds, you're putting yourself in the place of God. James is not saying planning is bad. He's not saying don't have any plans or don't make any future goals for the future. He's saying you cannot predict the future. It's still wise to save into a pension or save for a rainy day. Just don't fall into the arrogance that you know exactly how your life is going to be in 3 weeks, never mind 6 years. Think about how God will meet you in your real life, not this imaginary life that you have planned. And basically, submit your plans to God is the message. Proverbs 16:9, the Proverbs are kind of laced throughout James. He says, in their hearts, humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps. And that's basically what he's saying. You can trust the Lord to lead you where he wants to get you. And it's like, I've got these plans, God. I've got these things I'd like to see happen in my life. But God, I trust you with my future. My days are numbered, and my time and my vision are all yours, God. My ability to produce money or profit is not a guarantee going forward. And I don't think what James is saying here is that every time we talk about the future, we have to append the word God willing. I've met people who do this. Every time they see you, it's like, I'll see you for a coffee later, God willing. This sermon will end, God willing. And like it can become a bit of like one of those phrases that we kind of append. And he's not saying you have to say that every time you talk about the future. He's saying in your hearts, your future needs to be held by God, not in your own plans and dreams. It's okay to plan. Just don't be arrogant in thinking you know how it's all going to work out. And connected to this idea is simply the idea that we're called to live mostly in the present. I think this comes up in lots of Christian writing, is that we're called to mostly spend our time in the present, because after all, the present is all you have. The past is gone and the future isn't here yet. So I think the simple call to live in the moment and be with God in the moment and be with other people in the moment, it sounds like such a simple idea, but in our increasingly distracted world, I think it's a radical thought that we could be present in the moment. The future is unknown. End of this section, he says in verse 17, if anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them. Now this seems on the surface kind of almost like a disconnected idea. If you know you should do something and you don't do it, that's sin. This would be what we call like a sin of omission, something we didn't do that we knew that we should do. And I do think it is connected to these previous verses. James is saying, rather than worrying so much about your own will, focus on God's will. You can have great plans, you can have visions for the future, but don't let that distract you from the here and now where you already know what God's asking you to do. He's saying like this future orientation can distract you from the things you already know you're supposed to be doing. Just do those. And again, it's the James theme of action really matters. And again, humility is part of all of this. It's like, I don't know the future. God knows my future. He holds it in his hand. Okay, we're on to our third section for today. Are you braced for this one? Okay, here we go. Chapter 5, verse 1. Now listen, you rich people. Weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you. Your wealth has rotted, and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you. These are some serious words, and it's good when I can just say, it wasn't me that said it, it was James. Do you know? Just in case you start throwing any stones or anything like this. But he begins this section in the same way he does with the last. He says, now listen, which is kind of like his version of like Jesus is truly, truly, I tell you. You know, he's basically saying, pay attention to this moment here. And the section we just looked at before, he was talking about these kind of Christian merchants, these businessmen and women who were working within the Christian community, and he was talking about their attitudes to the future. This time the target is the rich, and as you can tell, it's very strong language. But one of the interesting things I found in studying it this week was that all the commentaries I read are quite clear that this section here is not actually aimed at the church. What James is doing in this moment, don't worry, it doesn't get us off the hook, but James, what he's doing in this moment is he's actually speaking to the culture in which they lived. And this theme of the rich is throughout James. You'll see it came across in the section on favoritism, where he said, don't you know the rich are the ones that are persecuting you? And it's those rich people who are persecuting the church that he's speaking into in this moment. He's calling out the rich and wealthy of his day. And it's a little bit like the prophetic books. You know, sometimes in the prophetic books, they speak to the culture. They don't just speak to the Christian community. They say, this is what's coming for those who live like this. Bad things are coming. And he uses some interesting phrases. Obviously, their wealth is disappearing before their eyes. And then this idea of moths eating in their clothes. Now, this should remind you of Jesus, because in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, do not store up for yourself treasure on earth where moths and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal. That's Jesus saying it. And James is basically picking up that exact same idea of people who are building treasure for themselves on the earth. And the point he's making to them is really simple. You think your wealth is going to last, but it won't. You think you've bought yourself security, but you haven't. It's false. And he talks about the idea of their gold and their silver corroding. Now, if you know anything about these metals, they don't actually corrode. Gold and silver don't rust, and the word is kind of used there as kind of for rusting. So they don't actually rust. But what James is saying is that even those metals that don't rust are rusting. The things you think you can put your security in, the financial security you have, is going to be taken away from you. And then he's got that very vivid picture of your flesh being eaten by fire. And in the Bible, when you've got fire, it's nearly always about judgment. So he's saying basically, judgment is coming. And he says, you've hoarded wealth in the last days. In other words, you've just accrued as much personal wealth as you possibly could over your lifetime. You have way more than anyone could ever need. And the reference to the last days is important. He's basically saying, you've misunderstood the season we're living in. This is the last days that we live in. So the last days was like from Jesus till Jesus returns. That's the last days period. And he's saying in the last days, we're supposed to be living knowing that Jesus is about to return. And him returning, he's returning to judge the world, is one of the things Jesus comes to do. And so he's basically saying you've lost sight of the season we're in. We're waiting on the king to come. And when he comes, judgment will come with him. And his critique of the rich continues. Not only have they amassed huge amounts of wealth, they've created systems of inequality and injustice. The wages they failed to pay the workers cried out against them. The Lord has heard the cries of the workers. Now, in their culture, the day workers that worked in the fields were heavily dependent on getting a daily wage. So they got paid every day. And when they had their wages, the wages were basically for paying for sustenance. It was paying for the basics of living. And so to not get your wages for one day could be the difference between you falling into abject poverty and you surviving. And he's saying in that day, in that culture, the workers were dependent on being paid at the end of each day. And someone's worked for you all day and you've not given them what they deserve is basically the message. And the idea of fraud's actually connected into the language that's being used here. He's basically saying you've defrauded them. You have not given them what they deserve. Now, to modernize it, what could we think about? There's lots of examples we could pull on. It's buy now, pay later schemes. It's payday loans with ridiculous interests which trap the poor and the needy and the people who do not have enough money. And the Lord is not okay with these systems of injustice. There should be something that rises up within us and goes, that's not okay. Do not take advantage of the poor. And the cry of the harvesters is the cry of someone who's basically starving and trying to support their family. And isn't it interesting that the Lord has heard their cry? Think of it maybe in our culture, the people who are struggling in our culture right now. God is not okay with systems of injustice. And he's not okay with people who are struggling right now in poverty without enough. He hears their cry. And the message of James is like, don't worry, it looks like the wealthy are just taking advantage, but there will be judgment. And he says in verse 5, you've lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. Now, these rich are living in absolute abundance and decadence, luxury beyond what we can imagine. They've indulged every desire they have because wealth has made it all possible for them. And then this interesting phrase, they got fat on the day of slaughter. In other words, while everyone else was struggling, they were living in abundance. Now, what would be a modern way of putting that? You got filthy rich while the economy crashed. While the economy was bombing, you made millions. Now, this is the sad history of modern economics that we see. We don't have to think back too far to examples of this happening. Whenever there is a crash, the majority of people really suffer. But the wealthy always get wealthier during a financial crash. They always end up with more money. Like, for example, just like COVID payments, all the payments that went out to people, where did that money end up? Well, it went to the workers who needed it to survive, and then they paid the shops, and then the shops' money came into the profits, and the profits went to the wealthy who owned the shops. So it's kind of like all the money that got injected into the economy didn't end up living in the lives of ordinary people. It got spent and used and passed on to the wealthy who actually own all the kind of resources that we have. Or think of the examples from the financial crash back in 2008. We've got banks failing left, right, and center, and we've got the government stepping in and doing these massive bailout loans. And even after all of that had happened, some of the CEOs of banks were still getting hundreds of £1 million bonuses for having done a good job. There should be something in us that goes, that's not okay. And James is basically saying that in his day, the exact same thing. Like, you got paid your £100 million bonus and families were on the street without homes. That's basically what James is saying here. And you should have that, there's that sense of anger and frustration. And in that last verse is really interesting. He says, you have condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you. Basically, he's saying that these people who are not wealthy were innocent. They didn't do anything to deserve it, and yet they suffered. The innocent are suffering because of your behavior. And then there's also a really interesting thing. One commentator, Tom Wright, noticed that this phrase, innocent one, can also be translated as righteous one, which opens up some very interesting kind of tie-ins that James is making here. So who was the righteous one? Jesus was the righteous one. And he ties it in here, and he's making a bigger point about the wealthy, but he's also tying it in here to say, basically, who were the ones that killed Jesus? It was the wealthy elite of the day. It was the Sadducees, it was the chief priests. It was the wealthy ones who killed the innocent, righteous one. And interestingly, James kind of ties that into Jesus. But interestingly for James is that he will also face that exact same fate. He will die at the hands of the wealthy in just a few years. He gets thrown off the temple, and there's all sorts of stories around what happened to James. So this was like a very vivid picture of what had happened to Jesus and beyond that. Now, this is a heavy passage. There's no kind of way around it. And as I say, he isn't actually specifically pointing at the Christian community in this moment. He's speaking, to the culture around them. That doesn't mean that it doesn't apply to us. I think that, the warnings are still there for us to hear about luxury and indulgence while people are suffering. And there's a lot of similarities to Jesus here because, Jesus had some hard things to say to a few people as well. And there's a section in Matthew where he has the woes, and he says, "Woe to you, Pharisees," and then he lists a bunch of things that they need to pay attention to. And this is basically what James is doing here. This is James's version of the woes. He wants to see the Christian community realize and get perspective on what's going on around them. Most of the Christian communities throughout history, and for James is especially true, were very poor. And he's basically letting them in on the big picture and saying, you might feel like all these wealthy people are both persecuting you, and maybe even part of you envies what they have. But he's saying, don't worry. There is a God who's above it all, and he will bring justice to the vulnerable. Don't fear they're not getting away with it, even if that's what it looks like. To modernize it, that offshore account or that underhand business deal to build that new data center or whatever it might be, don't worry, God sees it. Don't worry, God sees it. All will be revealed. Taking advantage of others will not be okay. The wealthy might seem powerful, but in the upside down kingdom, the first will become last, and the last shall become first. Now, the examples of this, like I say, are everywhere in our world, so let's not pretend this was just a problem for James. The billionaires of our days have more wealth than entire countries. And they can avoid tax by employing the best lawyers. They can build huge protective walls around themselves. And guess what? We have our first trillionaire. As of just this weekend, Elon Musk has now become a trillionaire. Now, $1 trillion is a hard thing to get your head around. I came across this kind of illustration of it to use a time scale. So if we think in terms of seconds in the past, 1 million seconds in the past is 2 weeks ago. Okay, 1 million seconds in the past is 2 weeks ago. 1 billion seconds is 1994. Okay, we're getting the scale. 1 billion is 1994. 1 trillion seconds would take you back to 29,000 BC. Just to paint a picture of the scale we're talking about here. Like, you just think 1 trillion, it's just a little bit more than 1 billion. No. And the message of James is like, yes, there are very ridiculously wealthy people, while there are many millions who are suffering in poverty, and that is not okay. But their evil will be exposed. The corruption will be exposed. The overindulgence will be exposed. And if you don't have faith in God and you don't believe that there will actually be a judgment, then many of these people will get off scot-free. Because that's the reality of our world, that many of these people have built enough legal protection around themselves to get away with whatever they want. But the message here of James is a hard message, but it's a message I hope we would all want justice. We'd want to know that there is actually going to be accountability for people who misuse their wealth. And so while I say the message is mainly aimed at the mega wealthy of James's world and the mega wealthy of our world today, there of course are implied messages for all of us. Hoarding, luxury, self-indulgence at the expense of others is not okay. And at the heart of what James is saying is the way that power can sometimes lead people to treat others. Because wealth effectively gives people power. The more wealth you have, the more power you have. And the more power you have, the more likely you are to use that power for your advantage over others. And James's basic message is, actually, all the resources you've been given are supposed to be to share love with others. Use your money, use your resources, your time, your energy to build people up, not tear them down. To bring systems of justice and fairness and hope to people who are the most poor, and not to trample them. Okay, so we made it through these 3 sections, hopefully. I think you're all still alive. And the first 2 are directed specifically at the Christian community. And then this last one is more directed at the kind of issues of wealth in our world. It seems like in some ways they're separate topics, but there is that one theme that goes through them, which is basically taking the place of God ourselves. And this is a theme in the way that we speak, it's a theme in the way that we make our plans for the future, and it's a theme in the way that we handle our wealth. We can put ourselves in the place of God in each of these areas. And so it's about, basically, he's addressing the issue of pride in our relationship, time, and money. I'll put that on the screen. He's dealing with pride in the areas of relationships, time, and money. Now, relationships, time, and money, I feel like there's probably like 3 teaching series in there for the future. But these are kind of 3 foundational areas. If you can follow God in the way that you handle your relationships, the way you use your time, and the way you use your money, I think you've actually got a healthy perspective on what it means to follow Jesus. And this idea of putting ourselves in place of God is kind of like us trying to put ourselves in authority. And James obviously starts off with slander. We speak badly about others because we think we're above this idea of loving our neighbor. And then he says, when we come to plan, we make great plans for the future and we find great success, but we don't actually trust God with our future. We put ourselves above God in that moment. And then finally, that warning to the rich. Wealth brings that power that makes us feel like little gods. That power that we can have over other people's lives. And he's saying, don't put yourself in the position of God. Don't get ideas above your station, or as we call it, pride. See, have a proper perspective on your life, relationships, and money. And interestingly, this is the original sin from the garden. Did God really say not to eat that fruit? Maybe you know better than him. And it's that same pride that has been throughout the whole journey of humanity. So the invitation is basically to not let that pride affect how we approach relationships in time and money. And we'll put the final slide up, Jake. Basically, three actions. We're to be loving to others and not speak slander to them. We're to submit our plans to God and trust him with our future. And then we're to use our money to bring justice and love others, to basically invest in good systems and good people. That's where our resources are supposed to be aimed. So a hard passage in many ways, but I hope you agree, James just cuts through the nonsense to get to the heart of matters. So let me just pray for us, and maybe the band want to come up and get ready. We'll finish with a final song in a minute. God, I thank you so much for your grace. I thank you that as we read last week, that you look to the humble, those who recognize their failings and come to you, and you give them grace and you lift us up. And God, if there's something about the way we are speaking about others, or something about the way that we're using our time, or something about the way we use our wealth and our money that is not what you call us to do, God, I pray you give us the grace to repent. And instead, I pray that as a community, we'd be known as those who work to build others up with our words and strengthen them and give them grace through our words. That we'd be those who, yes, make plans and dreams, but ultimately live in the moment and trust you with our future. And God, as we look around our world, we do see abundant, ridiculous wealth and inequality and injustices all around us. I pray that you'd help us, though we can't maybe solve all the problems, to work in the opposite spirit. To be those of generosity, to be those who put money into real human problems and human lives. Help us to invest in others. And help us to work towards systems that are fair and generous to all. Just give us the perspective changes that we need today, God, to be humble and follow your voice. So just take a moment and just ask the Lord if there's anything he might want to speak to you this morning. And then as a band, we'll lead us in a final song in just a minute. But just take a moment and just ask the Lord if there's anything he wants to say to you today.